Hello and welcome to this week's Business News Wales Weekly Business Review with me, Carwyn Jones, looking at all the issues that have affected the Welsh business community over the course of the past week. I'm delighted to be joined again today by two people who will be well known to you. Robert Lloyd Griffiths, who is the Director Wales of the Institute of Directors. Robert, a very warm welcome.
Thanks, Carwyn. Nice to be here.
And Frank Holmes, somebody who's been a stalwart of the business world in Wales for many, many years. Amongst his many achievements, he is now the chairman of the Cardiff Capital City region. Frank, welcome.
Thank you, and nice to be back.
Well, again, the world and Wales is in the grip of coronavirus. Perhaps more discussion over the course of the past week as to how we look to plan our way out of it from an economic point of view, whilst of course remembering the very real risks that still exist in terms of people's health. Now, of course, we all know the effect that the virus has had on the businesses and the livelihoods of so many people. That's why, of course, we've seen the various schemes introduced by the UK government and the Welsh government. One of the questions, of course, now that people will begin to look at is what happens in June when the furlough scheme comes to an end. We know that even if we were to return to normal tomorrow by some miracle, it would take some time for the economy to pick up and for employment to pick up as well. I mean, Robert, from your perspective, what are businesses saying to you about the post-furlough, post-government support era that will come after the current draconian lockdown comes to an end?
I think there's just this massive sense of uncertainty, Carwyn. I think, if we look back to when we spoke about Brexit week in, week out, uncertainty was the buzzword. But this is uncertainty on a whole new level. That there really is just little understanding of when we're going to get out, and depending on who we listen to, on what day, the length of time it's going to take, the new normal may be. So businesses are worried, they are concerned. I think they have, the furloughing system has been a lifeline. They have welcomed the opportunity to have been supported by both the Welsh government and also the UK government. But they recognise, I think, that this will come to some sort of end at some time in the not too distant future. And the worry, of course, is that furlough has been a lifeline. When you no longer have the lifeline, what do you have left? So for many businesses, the natural successor to furloughing will sadly be redundancies. And of course, from the perspective of planning, to make people redundant, sadly, you need a length of time. So the extension of the furloughing scheme just last week was really welcome, because that weekend, I think it was announced on the Friday, that weekend, many businesses that I speak to were making some really tough decisions. And those decisions will now be pushed down the line to 3 weeks' time. And unless, of course, the furloughing is to be extended or to be adapted somewhat further. So I think, we are lobbying as a business organisation within the IOD for an extension of furloughing. And it may well be that they look at furloughing sector by sector. We know, for example, the hospitality sector, we are told they will be the last ones to come back online. Now, we're hearing things like Christmas, maybe even 2021. So, we can't expect those businesses to be at sea for that long. So there is a sense of uncertainty, there's a little bit of fear, and just this lack of awareness as to how they're supposed to keep going for that length of time. And nobody knows when that might end.
Well, it's the uncertainty that's the problem, isn't it? We just don't know how long this will last, how long some restrictions will last, but not others. The whole thing is up in the air. Frank, from your perspective, what are you hearing from businesses you're in contact with? Are they starting to think about what happens post-furlough and what that might mean for them?
Yeah, I think a lot of businesses that are thinking about, post the crisis, the more astute businesses have divided themselves up into teams looking at dealing with the crisis, but also planning ahead. And I think that augurs well for those that are able to do so. But to Robert's point, there are many businesses that have got that luxury and inevitably, particularly businesses where they are footfall driven, whether it be in hospitality, leisure or retail, that is where there's going to be a big shift. But I think the government really needs, and both governments in that case, really need to start thinking about initiatives right now for the period ahead, because they really need to consider how they're going to redeploy workers from critical sectors and industries and regions even into those areas and away from those areas where there is potential expansion as opposed to shrinkage in activities. So that's going to require a huge amount of upskilling, moving workers out of the sectors that they're used to into areas where there may be growth, such as infrastructure, if stimulus comes back to play, which we all hope it will. But also the one thing that we're all finding out about this particular crisis is the importance of the gig economy.
True. Robert, from your perspective, do you think there's any advantage in circumstances such as this, size for a business, or are far smaller?
I think the latter. I think businesses at all sizes are vulnerable. But of course, we are a micro business economy. 97% of our 260,000 businesses here in Wales are micro businesses. So it's very difficult for them, as Frank outlined, to have a detailed plan in place. They're very much going along with the flow of the river and able to get to grip onto the bank. It's really very difficult for them. And in terms of the larger businesses, some of the larger businesses that I'm speaking with at the moment are very concerned about their employees going back to work for fear of the information they're hearing from the scientists. So it's a very difficult balance to get. Some people want to go back to work. Businesses want to get back to some sort of sense of normality, but people are frightened. They're worried about their own personal safety, and so all of these interplay with each other into having a very fragile sense of what's going to happen, when they're going to go back. And I think it depends on the scientific advice. We hear all the time that the governments are taking on board what the scientists are saying, but there's a sense to me that it's a difference between saving lives and livelihoods, and governments have some really difficult choices to make and to take in the next few weeks and months ahead about getting that balance right. That's the concern that I see in the economy at the moment.
What I found, dealing with crises in the past, nothing of this magnitude, but certainly things like foot and mouth, is that there is a natural tendency for politicians to be draconian at the beginning and then ease off slowly as time goes on. The problem is, if you ease off and then find you have to put restrictions back on, that annoys people even more. And people say, well, you should have foreseen this, because I think after 1945, you had the Labour government with a broken economy, and during that government's life, it had to introduce rationing for products that previously hadn't been rationed in the war.
Yeah.
And of course, that affects your popularity. And and if people think you don't know what you're doing, then they start to lose faith, not just in the governing party, but in government as a whole. So there will be a natural tendency to want to start off, quite tight and then loosen gradually and purely then on the basis of what it looks like in terms of health. Frank, from your perspective, any government will need as much support as possible from non-government organisations to put the Welsh economy back onto its feet as quickly as possible. What role do you think the capital region can play in revitalising and reinvigorating the Welsh economy as, whenever this happens, as we move out of the current crisis?
I think we put together our industrial economic plan probably just about 2 years ago now. And that plan was very much focused on certain key pillars in terms of connectivity, competitiveness and resilience. And I think if we stick to that plan, despite all the moving parts and the unpredictability and uncertainty that we're facing, it still focuses deploying our skills into those areas where we have strength. And I think that's a great place to continue to focus. And those strengths really, revolve around the compound semiconductor industry, which is an industry for the future, hugely valuable to the UK economy and clearly the Welsh economy, and the future of the Internet of Things and mobility, robots, and all the rest will be artificial intelligence. Will be highly reliant on that. We also have a very strong medtech presence in the region. And again, the way the world is going with aging population and so forth, there is huge potential there for an internationally, acclaimed center of excellence, certainly in medical devices and so forth. And then we have fintech. We have a very strong presence in insurance. So why aren't we looking at insurtech and funding that to link up with cyber, artificial intelligence, and so forth? So I could go on, and sectorially, obviously, a very strong presence in the creative industries, which is an international arena. We have some very strong filmmakers and game creators and so forth. So there's plenty to be positive about, but it's actually getting those effect clusters to really engage with each other and make the most of their ecosystems. And that's when we'll really start to see the strength of supply chain and actually taking care of ourselves, and being more self-sufficient as a nation. I think that's absolutely vital, that we have the capability of doing a lot amongst ourselves, and that links in very nicely to engaging more closely with the public sector, which also needs to innovate and become more productive, but at the same time, making the most of our procurement opportunities and the data that is vested in some of the largest sort of employers in South Wales, DVLA, the patent office and so forth, where there is huge amounts of the new currency, as you say, data.
You mentioned a very interesting point there when it was raised by Oliver Conger from British Rototherm when he appeared on this review, and he was making the point very strongly that we haven't protected our supply chain in the UK, and there are many businesses who could be producing but can't get the supplies because the supplies come from somewhere else. And perhaps now's the time to look at those supply chains and take a decision that actually security of supply is equally as important, if not more important, than actual cost. I mean, Robert, from your perspective, do you think there'll be a rethink in terms of the way businesses see their supply chains and the need to ensure security, as well as, of course, being able to buy at a competitive price?
I think inevitably one of the consequences of this situation would be a total root and branch look at how we work, how the supply chain operates, and also to protect and create opportunities from within. If we were to order internationally now, we wouldn't get the goods and services for a couple of months, if not longer. So I think we're going to have to really review everything as to how we operate both internally and within the greater UK and on a global perspective. But Frank is absolutely right. My glass is always half full. There's huge opportunities for Wales going forward. The insurtech, the medical side of things as well, and also we are world class, world beating in compound semiconductors. But we've got to get over this big hurdle for now until we get to there. It's a little bit like everything's in black and white now, and there's color in the future. This is very black and white, and this is hugely damaging. But we need to look at to the work that Frank is doing with his team, and they've made terrific inroads and great progress over the last couple of years. It's such a shame, obviously, on so many levels, of course, that this has happened now, because the city region project has made, as I say, massive strides. But we've got to get over this next few months in order to be able to maximise and take the opportunities, which undoubtedly will come because of all the hard work that Frank and his team are putting in, and many businesses up and down Wales.
Frank, you mentioned the point about the supply chain. What work needs to be done to persuade businesses that security of supply is an important factor together with competitiveness?
I think the message is out there loud and clear now, to be honest. And I think whereas the metric that's been used for some of the Emergency Resilience Fund in terms of measurement and ability to qualify for some of that grant assistance is based on loss of turnover, that really doesn't sit completely well with a lot of businesses. Where businesses will suffer is lack of supply. So, and they both go hand in hand. You know, if you haven't got the supply, you can't make the sales, whether it's market driven or not. So I think companies that have traditionally learned all those great lessons from our Japanese inward investors of years gone by, of having lean manufacturing capabilities, will realize that now they actually have to have higher stock levels, because just-in-time stock fulfillment may be a thing of the past. So the more secure, to your point, companies are in terms of being able to access stocks and components and materials and whatever else, the more resilient they will be in coming through this. So that must be a massive initiative amongst the SME sector as well as the larger companies.
Thanks for that, Frank. If I could move on to another issue, and I'll ask the two of you this. If I could come to you first, Robert. We've seen a plethora of support schemes that have been put in place by the UK government, the Welsh government, and by local government as well. Are there any gaps left? There have been suggestions that there were gaps at the beginning in terms of startups particularly. Are there still some gaps that need to be filled, do you think, Robert, to provide a fully comprehensive package of support?
No, I think both Welsh Government and UK Government have really stepped up more than anyone would have ever imagined in response to such cataclysmic circumstances. The recent launch of the Economic Resilience Fund for micro businesses, so prevalent here in Wales, and for larger businesses, and for medium-sized rather, and small to medium-sized, and then larger businesses, has been hugely impressive, and they've received huge numbers of applications, and I think they're being sifted through at the moment. UK government as well with the C-bills. These are governments trying to do things, in such difficult times. Of course, there are businesses that are falling through the net, sadly, and of course there will be businesses that will feel that they are unable to access certain funds because of the length of time they've been in existence. And I think that we need to look at those businesses. There are sectors, you mentioned the startups. We need to look at that. But I have to put myself in the position sometimes of the government setting up these grants as well. It's really difficult because they're doing their best to try and get all the information they need in order for those businesses to take advantage of it. So, my encouraging line would be contact the government, go through in Wales through the Business Wales website, go through the triage. Look at what are entitled to as a business, and rattle cages. And from my perspective in the Institute of Directors, and we're working with our members to try and ensure that they don't fall through the net. And I think that's the message that I would say is, do your best, do your homework, find out what's available, and go for it. And organisations like my own and the Chambers of Commerce and the CBI and the FSB are all looking out for their members at this critical and crucial time.
Are you hearing anything, Robert, in terms of, as there will inevitably be in a situation like this, of businesses that are getting support when they shouldn't be? With any scheme of business support, there will inevitably be some who will try it on, and often complain about it publicly. But is that something you're coming across at all?
It's not something I'm coming across, Carwyn, if I'm absolutely honest. Inevitably, there will always be those businesses that will paint a picture which perhaps isn't as bright and as rosy as it might well be for them. I put great faith in the integrity of business owners. The ones that I come into contact with are doing their utmost in absolutely extreme challenging times to do the best that they can. And I think this is one of the things that we're really keen to say is that business owners have a sense of responsibility, not only to the people that they employ, but also to their communities. And we've seen businesses doing some amazing things recently, and I wouldn't want to pick up necessarily on some of the negatives. Businesses like Great Penderyn, moving their production from our favourite tipple, into hand sanitizer. Even businesses like Admiral giving money back and refunding it to car drivers and van drivers. Great initiatives, because they recognise
that, Robert.
Pardon?
I very much welcome that.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well, absolutely.
Likewise.
But doing the right thing at difficult times to encourage people to stay at home. Laura Ashley, who went into liquidation a few weeks back now, starting to go back on a not-for-profit basis to actually make scrubs for hospitals. So that, these are just three examples. There are lots of businesses, and I think what we have seen is businesses coming together in response to creating manufacturing ventilators. Industry Wales has played a blinder in recent weeks, putting businesses together to ensure that much needed equipment goes to where it's most able to be used. So, of course, there'll always be some businesses that may take advantage, but there's an awful lot of good out there, and awful lot of businesses doing the right thing for themselves, for their employees, and also for their community and for Wales.
I mean, the reason why I ask as well is I've had the odd email in my other job, where people saying, "Well, I can't get support, but business Y over there is putting 2 applications and is getting twice as much support." I mean, it's quite. We're used to this, this kind of thing, where people say, "Well, my council tax is higher than theirs, even though we're on the same street," and so on. And quite often the comparison isn't the same.
But I think as well that one of the key things, Carwyn, sorry to interrupt, is that there will be a post-rationalisation of all funds that are given out. I mean, in terms of grants and economic resilience funds, for example, that I know that they will be as available to and transparent as possible to get the money out where it's needed most. But down the line, they will have to be checked that it's been spent appropriately. It's only right and proper because it's public money that they're spending. So, if a business is listening and they are like those that you mentioned in your postbag, think again, because there are businesses out there that really need the support. There are desperate, and these are desperate times, and businesses, many businesses I speak to, are desperate for continuity and to keep going. That's the key thing.
Thanks, Robert. Frank, any gaps from your perspective? Are there still areas that perhaps need to be plugged by the various different levels of government?
I think there's a couple of areas that spring to mind, and one of them was covered at the end of last week and is becoming more and more talked about this week, which is the Future Fund. So this is the convertible bridging loan arrangement that was announced last week to enable early stage companies and more advanced, more developed companies to obtain a convertible loan instrument, which the government will convert into equity on a subsequent funding round. So that is a very welcome initiative, because it's actually addressing the market that needs to sustain, because we have a great history of being innovative, and we can't lose that spark. It's a differentiator of us on the world stage. So I think that's been a very welcome. That scheme actually doesn't come into play until next month, but we're nearly there now. I think one of the areas that we've been looking at is plugging some of the sort of differentials in terms of the 80% guarantees on loans and civils. How do they find the 20%, etc. Also, I think supplying or providing bonding and guarantees for companies that haven't got the balance sheets to sustain those at the moment. I think that's another area that could be looked at. And then for the exporters, again on the same theme, UK export finance. There was talk of that being 100% guaranteed by the government. Is currently still sticking at 80%. So, exporting is a big important part of growing our economy, and maybe that 100%, the extra 20% can make a difference. So, there are a number of schemes out there. I think the other thing that we need to really look at is how they're being deployed, because delivery is everything. It's all very well having schemes, but if they don't get the money out to the companies, that's not going to help anybody. Some of the statistics out this week, and we write a weekly bulletin on these developments, are showing that civils are really only being pushed out at a much lower level than we would have hoped. And in fact, the bias is towards one bank out of all of the 40 lenders on that scheme, and that's NatWest. It wouldn't surprise any of us because it's owned by the government. One would expect them to sort of be upstanding in terms of deployment. but equally they were the first ones to waive personal guarantees. So at least the government is influencing the bank that we all own, I guess, at the end of the day. But they stand out amongst the banks that are performing at the moment. Let's hope the others catch up because they need to.
Let's move on then to just one other issue before we end. And one of those issues that people will start thinking about more and more over the next few weeks and months, and that is, how will this affect business life in the future? For example, will there be a need to have commercial premises that are as large as they are now? Will some businesses start saying, well, we don't need a 5-story building, we need a few meeting rooms, we have somewhere we can come into, hot desk perhaps, so we can have that human contact, but do we really need everybody being in a work every day? And then what does that mean for transport, for example? And there will be a rush hour in the same way as we've had in the past. But from your perspective, how do you see things changing in the future as a result of what we've seen because of COVID-19?
Well, for those of us that don't normally work from home, this has been a very, very steep learning curve. 4 or 5 weeks ago, I'd never used Zoom, I'd never used WebEx, or some might say that I'm unable to use them very successfully now, but I'm doing my best and we're learning an awful lot. I know now full well that I can work from home and I can sustain my role for quite a considerable time by working from home. Also, when we're released from lockdown, it is important that we have the human contact back within our daily working lives, because that's, we're humans after all. We like the interactivity. But there will be much different, I suspect, ways in which we will work in the future. You're absolutely right about the rush hour scenario. I was on a webinar earlier today when somebody mentioned the M4, and someone said, well, actually, perhaps we wouldn't need to have it done now. And of course, I probably disagree with that, but at the moment, we're managing. And so there'll be a whole raft of different ways in which we're working. We've proven that we can do it. I think many people who are working from home now will continue to spend a substantial amount of their time working from home in the future. But as I said before, it's good to have the opportunity to meet people. I think we're all, when social distancing ends or is relaxed, we'll be interfacing much better.
Frank, yourself, how do you see the future? How do you think business practice might change?
Well, I just certainly think business practice will change. Undoubtedly, I think speaking to a lot of companies and clients and others, one thing that everybody seems to be saying in common, and I'm sure Robert's probably heard this as well, that productivity has really shot up. And I guess with that, there has been a realization that we can do things more efficiently by using digital technology going forward. So I think that's here to stay. I think that transformation is already here and is embedding itself daily. Back to your point in terms of premises and so forth, there will always be, a way of turning those assets into something else. So whether it be offices or retail, you could quite easily see it being converted into other uses. Obviously, accommodation springs to mind because we do have issues in that respect. So I see that as very, very likely going forward. The other thing, of course, is business travel. So, and I'm not talking about driving down the M4. I'm talking about jumping on planes and so forth to go to meetings around the country or overseas. And I think this nightmare that we're going through has shown that we can actually make the most of getting things done without actually having to resort to that. So clearly that will have a knock-on effect to the airline industry as well. So there are going to be winners and losers in all of this. That's what a big shake-up does. And the resilient ones will be those that can adapt, take the knock, stand up again, change their model, and bounce back. Who knows when, but in hopefully not too long away.
Of course, what we're doing, people of our generation, are catching up with people 30 years younger than us. because they're well versed at doing it. So I think it will
Yourself.
change. Pardon?
Speak for yourself.
I was. But they're well versed in digital communications, and I think many of us are, as I say, just catching up. And I think that as that generation moves forward, this will become the norm.
One thing I hope that doesn't become virtual is the assembly. What committees can meet virtually, because they're far more business-like than the assembly. It is very odd to sit there in a virtual assembly plenary when all you can hear is one speaker and no other sound, because the place is, the heckling is a little bit of it, the wittier the better, not screaming and shouting. As to the atmosphere of the assembly, it is very frustrating to listen to some of the speakers and not be able to say anything as they're speaking. Yeah. So, I wouldn't want to see that happen where you have to sit there and listen to things. You can't intervene, and you can't make the odd point. But there we are. I think we'll wait and see. We'll wait and see how it develops in the future. Gentlemen, we've run out of time. Thank you very much for joining me on this podcast today. Robert, good to see you again.
Nice to see you, Carwyn.
And yourself, Frank. I know, Frank, you came on at very short notice. I'm very, very grateful for that.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
You've been listening to the Business News Wales Weekly Business Review with me, Carwyn Jones. We'll be back again next week looking at all the issues that have affected the business world over the course of that week. Hope to see you then, but in the meantime, keep safe.